So my name is Kevin Guine. I work as a researcher and writer based in Edinburgh, and my work explores the intersection of data and identity. So I'm the author of the forthcoming book, Queer Data Using Gender, Sex and Sexuality Data for Action, which is coming out in January 2022, and also run a small research consultancy called EDI Scotland. So these experiences have engaged me in a range of different types of research projects, mainly with small organisations based up in Scotland, around the design of questions on identity. So my session this morning, it lasts around 40 minutes, and it's my hope that I will cover the following outcomes. So my hope is that by the end of the session, you will have an increased knowledge around some technical questions on diversity monitoring, as well as conceptual challenges, and you leave with a kind of boosted sense of confidence in how to engage in discussions around diversity monitoring data, and importantly, an enhanced critical thinking about the intersection of data and identity characteristics. I think the main takeaway from this is what I'm really hoping that the main takeaway from the session today is what happens at that space between data and identity, where those two things kind of come together and then clash. So I'm going to speak for around 20 minutes. I'm outlining some of these kind of key themes, and then going to pause for a wee bit and then use the final 15 minutes of the session today to really respond to any questions or queries that you might have in your work. And I therefore really encourage you to pop any questions now into the chat box or throughout the discussion, and we'll pick them up at the end of the session today. So I think what's really important when speaking about diversity monitoring is to look at kind of what is meant by this term. So diversity monitoring involves the use of a short online survey to gather information about the identity characteristics of staff or service users. It's all diversity is about recognizing, respecting, and valuing people's differences. It's often understood as a prerequisite to work around equality and inclusion. In work undertaken in the public, private, and voluntary sectors in the UK, diversity, equality, and inclusion is often discussed in relation to the 9 protected characteristics covered in a piece of legislation called the 2010 Equality Act. Now, on the screen there, you can see the list of the protected characteristics in the Equality Act, and I'm not going to go through them in detail, but I'm conscious from the message I've received, my slides aren't being shared. Let's see, there seems to be an issue with the slides moving forward. Let's see if that works instead. We seem to be either getting one slide or just me. Let's see. Let's see. So if I do this, hopefully, are the slides moving now? So if I move these slides in reader view, are people seeing slide transitions? Sorry about this. It seems to be, this doesn't seem to be working. I'll try once more and hopefully, fingers crossed, we can get this fixed. So let's see, thumbs up if this has worked this time, fingers crossed. Happy days, success. So sorry about that. So I haven't missed any slides, which are hugely important. I was just outlining some of my past work in this space and some of the learning outcomes, which I'm going to cover in today's session. I think this slide is particularly key, which unfortunately you missed. This is really getting at the main takeaway from the session today. So what happens in that space between data and identity, that space when the two things come together. In diversity monitoring, as I kind of earlier mentioned, There's a difference between diversity, equality, and inclusion, and this will be kind of teased out in the talk today. And then bring us up to where I was on the identity characteristics in the Equality Act. So as I mentioned, I'm not going to go through these in detail today, but just to mention that people can feel disadvantaged and marginalized due to a range of other identity characteristics not covered by the Equality Act, as well as how these identities intersect. And that's a topic I'm going to pick up later on in the workshop. I'm sure for lots of your work across different organizations, there will also be a long list of different reporting requirements related to diversity monitoring data. This can include stuff around the Equality Act, for larger organizations, things such as gender pay gap reporting within your different sectors, any benchmarking against comparator organizations, any diversity monitoring requests from any funders, as well as internal reporting. So this all really goes to underscore how diversity monitoring is not an abstract exercise. It's not something that people can choose to throw out the rulebook and start afresh. Diversity monitoring takes place in a predetermined landscape with rules, customs, and particular ways of working. So while we acknowledge the existence of these rules, this very much challenges the idea that diversity monitoring is something ahistorical, apolitical, or value neutral. Instead, diversity monitoring becomes a question of what data tells us about identities, as well as how power operates across these different activities. So collecting more data on identity characteristics might seem like people are belatedly invited to a data party from which they have historically been excluded. However, this historical moment also presents a double-edged sword. Attempts to categorize and establish who counts means that some people are always left behind. As the philosopher Michel Foucault describes in his work on governmentality, a greater knowledge of a population does a lot more than simply strengthens the powers of the state. It can also enhance data practices that govern the borders of who or what is possible. So rather than jumping to plug any of these data gaps, in today's workshop, I want us to think critically about whether these data gaps actually matter. Some points I share might make you double take or might seem a bit counterintuitive, such as, do we actually need more data? However, the need for more critical thinking is vital. And in today's session, I'm going to hopefully cover these three themes. So first of all, looking at the question of who counts, and I'll kind of touch on some of my work around UK censuses and the topic of intersectionality, before moving on to look at the question of moving targets. So how do we collect data in ways that acknowledges how identities can change across time and space? And thirdly, the question, who is in the room? How do we examine who makes decisions about diversity monitoring? And for those who find themselves in the room where decisions are made, what are the key questions that you need to ask? So even though the data quality is patchy, we do currently have more data and more detailed data about people's identity characteristics than at any previous point in history. However, this data has not so far solved the problem of discrimination, of inequality, or of injustice. We therefore all need to consider how we best go about collecting diversity monitoring data so that it impacts people in a positive way. So with this in mind, the first question that I hope to explore is this question of who counts. So diversity monitoring is really all about who counts, both in terms of who is counted and who or what is responsible for doing the counting. Questions as to who counts are best explored by considering an example of diversity monitoring that takes place on a national scale, a census. So as it happens, 2021 and 2022 are actually census years in the UK. And in the UK, this consists of three separate counts. So one taking place in Northern Ireland, one in England and Wales, both of which took place in March earlier this year, and a third count taking place in Scotland, which is taking place in March 2022, postponed for a year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So census questions are a particular area of interest to me, and I've conducted research around the design of new voluntary questions on sexual orientation and on trans status or history in Scotland's forthcoming census. So this is the first time these questions are being asked in the national census, and their passage through the Scottish Parliament was really interesting in that it did invite a surge of interest in data about LGBTQ lives and experiences. So as part of the design process, there were situations where representatives of LGBTQ groups and organisations were invited into Parliament to kind of share information about their lives, but also to justify themselves to those in positions of power, whether it be in consultations, in parliamentary evidence sessions, and in the media. The counting of trans people in the census also meant that these developments became a hot-button issue for trans exclusionary campaign groups in Scotland, who took issue with some of the approaches around the collection of data on women where they were inclusive of trans women. The inclusion of LGBTQ people in the census was therefore not a straightforward success story, as some might wrongly assume. And although the census will now count those who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans, the census does not meaningfully count those who identify as non-binary, who are required to identify their sex as either male or female. I share these examples to really underscore the need to adopt a critical eye to data development, and how attempts to categorise and establish who counts as LGBTQ means that some people are always left behind. In this example, those most likely to gain from tweaks to data practices that improve inclusion are individuals who are already closest to that ideal of full equality. So in my example of LGBTQ data, that means white, cis, middle-class, gay men. Surface-level changes to data practices can therefore stifle structural progress and have the risk of potentially entrenching inequality in ways that are actually harder to tackle. So this question of who counts is really contingent on another concept I want to introduce around intersectionality, a theme that is often overlooked or ignored in diversity monitoring exercises. This is arguably the product and partly the product of the Equality Act, which encourages us to think about identity as 9 discrete characteristics. Thinking about how intersectionality brings some issues into view while leaving other issues, pushing them further into shadows, I wanted to think about how this might apply more broadly to diversity monitoring activities and any work to address inequality in our organisations. So legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw has helped popularise the concept of intersectionality by demonstrating how ideas of race and gender play out in civil rights cases in the US. I'll give you a few seconds to read that quote on the screen there. So for Crenshaw, traditional approaches to addressing inequality limit the terms of inquiry to a single axis that favoured the interests of individuals who experienced inequality because of one factor, such as gender or race. Crenshaw's analysis notes that in discrimination claims brought by Black women, they were sometimes told that the data presented was inadmissible because of the small numbers of people in the sample. They were told to expand the sample size so that it included either all Black people or all women. However, by expanding the coverage of the data, this could transform the data in ways that weakened its original meaning, as it now included the least marginalised among women and the least marginalised among Black people. An intersectional approach is not a fancy way of doing equality and diversity work, nor is it a more progressive means to discuss inclusion. Intersectionality is about the transformation of systems, structures, and institutions. Scholar and activist Dean Spade makes this point more eloquently in his writing, describing the dangers of approaching social justice work that promotes interest of those who experience marginalisation through a single vector of identity. Now again, I'll give you a second to read Spade's quote there. So as the quote suggests, an intersectional approach to diversity monitoring data does not require us to run analysis by all identity characteristics for every potential variable. An intersectional approach does, however, have a particular history, and when applied to diversity monitoring, we must ensure we do not lose sight of its radical roots. So moving on to the second kind of key theme I want to pull out around diversity monitoring, and it's looking at moving targets. To make things even more confusing, diversity monitoring exercises, I argue, conduct a false account of people's identity characteristics as something frozen in time and space. However, identity characteristics are historically situated, as we know from studies of past societies and cultures. What it means to identify as disabled in 2021, for example, is different from 1971 or 1871. An individual's identity characteristics can also change over time. For example, someone working with your organization might change their religious identity, their sexual orientation, their view of themselves as disabled, or association with an ethnic group. The fluidity of identity means that data collected about a sample can actually drastically change in a very relatively short period of time. Data collection tools must therefore be able to accommodate how these identities are fluid and temporal, and this might involve things such as providing people with ways to update their data on an as and when basis. Now, fluidity is not only a product of time, but also of location. So the ways that we conceptualize identity characteristics are specific to the UK, both in terms of the words and the language we use to describe these concepts. In France and Germany, for example, it's uncommon and in many situations illegal to capture data about a person's race or ethnicity. These restrictions partly relate to historical factors such as legacies of the Second World War and the use of identity documents and categorization of people during the Holocaust. Although framed as a means to avoid division, this lack of data can actually obscure the marginalized experiences of racial and ethnic minorities and make it easier for those opposed to anti-racist initiatives to say that problems simply do not exist. In South Asian countries, including Nepal, India, and Pakistan, national censuses have collected data on sex that provides options beyond male and female. For example, in 2011, Nepal became the first country to conduct a census that allowed respondents to identify as a third gender. In 2019, in Kenya, they became the first country in the world to collect national data on their intersex population. Many other countries around the world also provide legal recognition for people who identify as non-binary. So just because the UK does not legally recognise non-binary people does not mean that this identity doesn't exist. For those responsible for the design of diversity monitoring activities, these are challenges that you're very much likely to face, particularly if you work with people and communities from outside of the UK. We must avoid adopting a colonial mindset that understands the UK's approach to diversity monitoring as universal or forces individuals with experiences outside of the UK to change how they identify so that they fit with UK-specific standards. Reimagining identity characteristics as moving targets reconfigures traditional understandings of diversity monitoring methods and the information they provide about people's lives. These examples also, importantly, underscore how decisions made about the design of diversity monitoring questions bring some identities into light while pushing other identities further into the shadows. So the third and final theme that I want to discuss is the question of who is in the room. So the actions of those who design diversity monitoring exercises are never neutral, and we must explore what they preclude from view. It's not practical for everyone who's in decision-making spaces to bring lived experiences to the table. We therefore need to ensure that those with power to make decisions about data are empowered to ask the right questions. So if you find yourself in a position of influence, and if you find yourself in the room where these decisions are made, I've suggested 6 questions to ask that really probe at who's being included and excluded from the exercise. So the first question that I want you to ask yourself is, what is your end goal? So the collection of diversity monitoring data is not an objective in itself, nor should the ambition be to gather good data or to simply fix the numbers. What's key here is that you assess what you want to achieve by collecting this data. Secondly, ask yourself the question whether or not your methods present an authentic account of people's lives and experiences. So rather than aim for a really tidy data set, it's important to recognize that data about identity is leaky, it's pluralistic, and it can change over time. This might mean that you need to provide multiple response options or develop other means, such as letting people write answers or use open text boxes. A third question to probe is who makes decisions about data? As far as possible, decisions that disproportionately impact minority communities should be made by people with experience of those communities. The fourth question to ask if you find yourself in the room where decisions are made is, does your project create more good than harm? Assess what diversity monitoring is likely to achieve and any potential to cause harm, and only continue when the potential benefits outweigh the potential dangers. The fifth question, and this is one of them that might seem a bit counterintuitive, do you actually need more data? It's important that you do not assume the need for more data, as enough evidence of a problem might already exist to justify the need for action. It's also really important to explore who's already engaged in data practices on the topic and see if your resources could maybe help support existing initiatives rather than starting something afresh. And finally, are your ways of working open, accessible, and transparent? So traditional approaches to data collection kind of misunderstand this approach as an objective account of reality, whereas, as I've argued, there's a lot of subjectivities and a lot of decision-making in this process. So here it's really key to be open about your own biases and assumptions, and also be open about the limitations of the tools that you use to collect data. So I've shared quite a lot of information, and hopefully, even with the kind of slight technical mishap at the start, you were able to pick up the kind of key threads of the session today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause for around 2 minutes, and we'll give you a quick time to run to the toilet or make a quick drink. And what I really encourage you to do is pop any questions or queries into the chat box, and in the kind of second half of the session, I'll pick up those questions and queries and just hopefully be able to respond to any challenges or any problems that you've encountered through your work. So we'll start the 2-minute clock, and I'll pick things up again in a couple of minutes. Okay, so hopefully that was I always appreciate a quick break to kind of grab something from the door or quickly respond to an email. So thank you for those who've shared questions, and I'm going to say a little bit more before kind of responding to them. So just to really underscore kind of once you've collected this data, what happens next? Where do we go from here, really? And part of that is using data for action. So in this presentation, I've kind of shared some, what I would say, probably some critical provocations as the collection of diversity monitoring data, which kind of leaves us asking, what do individuals actually stand to gain from being counted? So when engaged in critical studies of data, we must deal with multitudes. We can celebrate developments, but we can also reflect upon what was lost along the way and continue to ensure that when data is used to improve the lives and experiences of those about whom the data relates. Data, I've seen in my own work, can play a really key role in responding to government consultations and engaging politicians, to change and protect laws, to educate and to empower individuals to make a difference, and to use the media as a means to change narratives about people's lives, and to work with institutions to create spaces that are both inclusive and equal. When making demands for legal equality, knowing your numbers can really help strengthen claims brought to court and provide an evidence base for action. Being counted is also a key way to fight back against campaign groups who call for the exclusion and erasure of communities. All of these ambitions, however, rely on evidence falling on the ears of people with power that wish to listen. So hopefully, one of my arguments is there's nothing intrinsically good or bad about the uses of data for action. Even the ethics of loaded terms such as big data, predictive analytics, and surveillance depend on the motives of those behind these projects and for whose interests they serve. However, as data practices look likely to reach further into our everyday lives, it's important that we pause to consider whose interests are served through diversity monitoring activities. So to wrap things up and before kind of jumping into the questions, my workshop today has really raised some kind of critical ideas about diversity monitoring data and underscored how the design of diversity monitoring activities do not arrive with organizations as some sort of ahistorical or apolitical artifact. They are crafted, they are tweaked, they are changed to serve the particular interests of individuals, organizations, and ways of thinking. They have the fingerprints of their designers all over them. So it's too early to assess the impact, really, of expanding the collection of diversity monitoring data, or whether this data is always being used to meaningfully impact people's lives in a positive way. However, we should not lose sight of this key moment in history, as being counted can and does change people's lives for the better. And just one final shout out for any interest in this topic. I did have an article come out earlier this year in the Journal of Gender Studies on particularly looking at the design of the sexual orientation and trans questions in Scotland's 2022 census, but more broadly looking at the limitations of capturing data on identity. So there's a link there on the screen. It's called Constructing a Queer Population, Asking About Sexual Orientation in Scotland's 2022 Census. And I'll pop the link into chat box as well. So if I stop sharing my screen now. And have a look at this. So thank you for these questions. I'll try my best to get through them in the next 5 minutes or so. I'll start actually just at the bottom, so with Claire. We're phone-based debt advice. People are. So Claire, thank you for your question. And I'm not sure if everyone else can see the question and answer tab, but Claire's question is, we're a phone-based debt advice charity, and they're about to start asking all clients about ethnicity, disability, and gender reassignment on every call. People calling are often distressed. Any advice? This is quite a challenging question, I think, in how do you kind of explain to people why are you collecting this data? And particularly with the Equality Act, the 9 characteristics should be viewed equally. So people should really in theory be asking as much about disability and gender reassignment as they are gender and ethnicity. I think what's really important is making it clear why these questions are being asked, and also how is this data being used. What I'm also really clear about in my own work is really giving people the space not to share that information if they want. People don't have any obligation to share details about their identity or how they identify. So I think it's making it as acceptable as possible for people to choose not to disclose information if they don't wish to do so. I'll move on to the next question on this list, which is from Rima. And this is around what is the best way to influence the people in the room to ensure they're making the right decisions, to be inclusive to those who are currently being marginalized in a data collection exercise. And this is a challenge. As I kind of tried to suggest in the final 6 key questions to think about if you find yourself in the room where decisions are made, I think it's kind of maybe trying to think outside of yourself or trying to think critically and reflect on what you bring to the space, but also what's not being brought to the space, and trying to account for those gaps and absences in the room. As I suggested in my presentation, we can collect a huge amount of data and evidence and really robust data and evidence, but actually, if it comes to bringing that data and evidence to somebody who doesn't wish to take action, we often find ourselves pushing in closed doors. And I think that's a challenge for those working with data on how do we actually get those with the power to take action and to do something about it. And there's a huge amount of questions here, and unfortunately, I don't think we'll get through all of them. But if I maybe go to the next one on the list. The question from Hannah is fascinating and actually really challenging. So Hannah's question is, do you have any advice on the ethics or practicalities of collecting diversity monitoring data with or about young people? So particularly with my work on gender, sex and sexuality data and young people, this is a fascinating area. But if you think of the slide where I had all those identity characteristics moving about and jumping on the screen, this is often particularly the case for younger people. I think even when we've looked at some recent studies among how people who would be the kind of Gen Z generation identify and conceptualize ideas of gender, sex and sexuality and how these concepts interrelate, to some regard, our existing diversity monitoring forms maybe aren't best suited to capturing that information. I think as a starting point, it's always great to speak to people and ask how do they think this process would work? How would they feel comfortable sharing this information? How much or how little information would they like to share? And also do the questions that you've maybe designed, do they work for the group that you're working with? So I think consultation here is really key. I'll do one more question and let's see. So pick up a question from Oliver on ethnicity. And this is, again, a question that comes up a fair bit. And it's about how do we group together, or how do we kind of divide ethnic groups when we're doing work around race and ethnicity? I'm sure many of you have heard of the term BME for Black, Asian, Minority Ethnic, which is a problematic term, but it is often used in data as a means to kind of aggregate together very distinct and different ethnic minority groups, which would then be compared against white. In Oliver's question, though, he does also highlight that within the white group, there's a huge amount of diversity within that as well, and a range of minority ethnic groups that might fall under white, including Irish, Roma, Gypsy, Traveller, for example. I think the best way to kind of respond to this challenge is to, first of all, think what is the research question you're looking to answer, and what is the size of the kind of the group that you're working with? Are you able to do something quite in depth, or is it more meaningful to maybe do something at that higher level of BME and white? I think, again, going back to one of the slides I shared about the limitations of your approach, there's no harm in your write-up or for this in actually stating that if you are using aggregated groups, there are limitations and there are blind spots to that. And that, again, explaining the rationale for maybe why you've made that decision if the numbers are quite small. So I think that's probably enough I can get through during right now. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just share my screen as I wrap things up for you. And hopefully you can see on the screen there my Twitter handle and my email address. And I'm always happy to kind of engage in any chats or discussions or field any questions or queries you might have and that I was unable to answer during the session today by email or by Twitter as well. And hopefully this has left you maybe asking more questions about diversity monitoring data. Kind of when I wrote this, I hoped it would maybe make people's lives easier, but when I was finished with the presentation, I realized actually it's maybe posing more questions than answers. But there's also no harm in that. I think what I want you to leave today's session is thinking critically about why do we collect diversity monitoring data, how do we collect it, and who is included and excluded from these processes. So thank you very much for joining my session today. Apologies again about the technical issues at the start. Hopefully you didn't miss too much at the start of the session in the slides. And thank you again for joining me in this morning's session.